Hi, and welcome back to another PSCA Roundtable. We really wanted to take some time, particularly over the past few weeks, to have a really deliberate conversation as far as equity and anti-racism. So we have a large group of panelists today to have hopefully a very vibrant conversation. Again, I'm Steve Sharp, and if we could start with maybe Dana and work ourselves around like we did before.
Hi, I'm Dana Wile. I'm a high school counselor at, in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and I have been doing anti-racism work since a very young age in high school, and I continued that with the Leadership Summit Dialogues on Racism in Lancaster County, started for high school students to have some conversations around these, and then continues to guide my practice with students.
Jason?
Hi, I'm Jason Pedersen. I'm a school psychologist in Hershey, Pennsylvania, Dairy Township School District, also the delegate rep to the NASP Board of Directors and on the Social Justice Committee there. And I've been doing this for quite a long time, but have more recently been spending time doing presentations and trainings for staff and for school psychologists on disproportionality in discipline and implicit bias.
Nikole.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Nikole Hollins-Sims. I'm an educational consultant for the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network, otherwise known as PaTTAN. I work primarily out of our Harrisburg office, and my current role is serving as the co-statewide lead for the Behavior Initiative. So similar to Jason, my passions have been around disciplinary practices and reducing disproportionality, particularly for students of color, and using an MTSS framework to approach that. And I'm happy to be here.
Happy to have you. Amber.
Oh, Dr. Amber Sessoms. I am a school psychologist in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and Central Dauphin School District, primarily in Central Dauphin High School. And my work primarily serves around talking about and teaching about race and isolating that. We're talking about equity and making sure that we understand what is whiteness, what is blackness, what is anti-blackness in those spaces. So having those conversations with our staff, our administration, and how do we work towards being authentic in those conversations, having those conversations, being able to speak up, and having courageous conversations surrounding race.
Mindy?
Yeah, hi, I'm Mindy Willard. I'm the School Counseling and Transitions Coordinator for the Madison Metropolitan School District in Madison, Wisconsin. I'm also the Advocacy and Public Relations Director for the Wisconsin School Counselor Association. Past American School Counselor Association School Counselor of the Year, and I used to be in Arizona, so I was past president of ASCA as well. So I get around, and I pride myself on the work that I do with school counselors, not just in my own district, but across the nation, and being a voice for counselors and helping our counselors to just be better and do better. And I think for me, I was telling everyone, I feel like I'm just starting this journey. It's work that I've always kind of been a part of, but it's been a lot more explicit in the last few years. And a lot of the intentional work that I've done is just blowing my mind with some of the learning that has occurred for me. So I'm here to kind of talk to those of you that are just starting and helping you to know how to just keep going with this this equity work, because it's important and it's going to save lives.
Alicia?
Yes, thanks. My name is Alicia Oglesby. I am a high school counselor. My official title is Director of School and College Counseling at Bishop McNamara High School in Prince George's County, Maryland. I'm also a co-author of a book for school counselors called Interrupting Racism.
I'm sorry to interrupt. It's actually, it looks like it's currently the #1 Amazon bestseller.
Woo, hey!
All right, I just got a notification.
Thanks for that qualification. Thanks, Steve. And so I co-authored that book with Rebecca Atkins, who is in central office in Wake County, North Carolina. I also wanted to mention, I forgot to mention it earlier to this group, that I am on the advisory board for Teaching Tolerance, which is a great resource for educators throughout the country on issues related to anti-racism, equity, inclusion, diversity, in all of its various forms. So thanks for having me.
Yeah. With all these things, I just want to be clear. There's a wide range of experience and expertise and across disciplines. I appreciate the work that our school psychologist friends have been doing. We've been partnering with ASP for a lot of really exciting work. And again, we want to make sure that we're bringing a broad view of the school counseling profession here into the conversation as well. I'm really excited about it. It's all meant to be conversational. So please come, listen, take notes, and we'll have additional resources available on the website that we'll highlight later on. With that being said, we want to also make sure that we're being valuable, taking good use of everyone's time, especially yours as a listener. So we want to just hit it right off the bat. What are the key principles or concepts that you feel every educator should know about either anti-racism or educational equity?
I can start. I think for me, one of the things that we need to realize is we're so immersed in it that we don't even realize it's happening around us sometimes. White folks is what I think our Black colleagues and our Black students feel it and see it every day. But for me, some of the systemic things, there's always been an analogy that you ask a fish what they think about the water and they say, what water? What do you mean? They're not aware. And so for me, the last couple of years have been so eye-opening to things that I'm going, oh my gosh, that is happening. And I wasn't always aware of it because it's the way that things have just always been in our society. And I've benefited from a lot of that due to my position and my power in society and in schools. And so I think for us is just you might not see it as an issue or you might not be aware, but it's there. And the most important thing is to talk to your colleagues of color, your students of color, and believe them. We're not here to argue with their existence and their experience. We have to listen and believe them, and we have to make sure that we have people of color in our schools. We're a predominantly white female population between counselors and teachers, and we have to really advocate for having more representation for our students in our schools so that we can ensure that all of those voices are being heard.
Yeah. Just hearing that, I always think of the movie Wall-E and just that spaceship out there. It's like we've all become passengers on like some ship that was not designed by us, and we've all been given all these different roles that have been inherited that we don't know. And we think that this is how it's supposed to be, but from any outsider looking in, you can see it's so far from its potential and what it could be. And that's why I always think of, like, when I hear those types of metaphor, I think you're really on point, Mindy. I really appreciate that. I mean, like, you can look at the protests right now from the outside looking in, whether it be in France or in Canada or in Amsterdam or across the world, where people are marching in solidarity, because from the outside looking in, it feels like missed potential, I think.
Right.
What are some other thoughts as far as those key pieces for educators?
Yeah, I can add. I think that we are very much immersed in a culture, in an American culture that tends to be very agreeable. And I think that as professionals, sometimes, when we're involved in faculty meetings and meetings with families, that we tend to err on the side of agreeing. And I think that we really need to become more comfortable with disagreeing in a way that is productive, in a way that shines light on a perspective that might be marginalized. And so that can look like many different things for counselors who are in schools. I sit as director of my department, and so I'm in a lot of meetings with administration and directors from other departments. And I'm usually the person in the room to disagree with something or an idea or a perspective that I think may be harmful to our students. And so I think that sometimes becoming more familiar with that, practicing that sort of dissent is really important. We are in the midst of having conversations with our mayor in DC, because as many of you know, you've probably seen the beautiful yellow letters on 16th Street, which, we've gotten to go down as a family and see, and it's really exciting and it's really wonderful. And at the same time, we are still in disagreement with our mayor about some of the policies around policing in the district. And so I think we can have these moments where we're collaborating and working together, where we also need to represent the voice of our marginalized students and communities.
I would agree. I definitely think it's important for us as we talk about ed equity, what that looks like and what that translates into when it's put into practice. So one of the things that I do in the state is go and do trainings around equity. And oftentimes I hear from people that are in rural districts or even suburban fringe that why do I need to know about equity? We don't have any differences in race here. And in reality, equity is the fabric of everything you should be doing. So even if you don't have someone that looks different than you, you have pockets of communities in your homogeneous white group that deserve and need access that's different from the majority. So this has even shown a spotlight on the importance of white people knowing that they need also things given to them to provide them additional access. So they may not have thought about it, as Mindy pointed out before, but now there's a spotlight there that there are groups that have been marginalized, that have not had a voice. And that's what equity is supposed to do in our educational systems, is to provide that opportunity to have a seat at the table, for lack of cliche terms. So it's important for us to remember as educators that equity does apply to everyone, in a similar sense that we're looking at racism. We can talk about homophobia, transphobia, and other phobias and racisms and isms that come up. But right now, to have the spotlight on racism is so long overdue. And for me, as a Black female professional educator, I say, why now? That's part of where I'm struggling, because George Floyd is a long laundry list of others that have had a similar outcome. And I don't know if it's because of COVID that we're now forced to pay attention. But no matter what the cause is, I'm hopeful that our white brothers and sisters are from other groups, as they're paying attention, that it's just not for this moment, that they actually translate that into action and put the steps forward needed.
Yeah, and I want to then add to that too. I feel some of that same frustration. I'm like, why are you only paying attention now? like where were these marches, before? So I want to say that in terms of relating specifically to question one, that like this, if you're just jumping on board with this and like just now waking up to the fact that how this really affects and you're on fire about this. I don't think any school counselors were completely blind to it. At least I hope not. It's technically a part of our part of our ethical standards, a part of our counselor education. But if you are, I also want to say like this is going to be a tough journey. You're going to have to be humble. You're going to have to step back, especially as extroverted white counselors, and use your voice to advocate to our students, but not in the sense of maybe speaking on behalf of someone, empowering our families and our students to come to the table. And that's one key principle concept, is that like the education system was created by people who, one, the education system worked for, right? Like very rarely do you have someone who hated school become a teacher, very rarely. And two, it's this industrial complex that just stems from this white supremacy and white hierarchy. And so there's a lot of families that advocating for their student, if they're in a marginalized population, is not a safe thing for them. So, white parents are more likely to come to the table because they know what the system looks like. And so some of that will be an advocate, but also in a way that we can empower our families and our students to know that we support them to be their voice as well. It's going to be hard work.
Yeah, you've all just really touched on things that I've been grappling with. And I would just add that making sure that we're being intentional. So when we talk about equity, or when I'm in meetings and I'll talk about, let's disaggregate the data, looking at race, and I'll get comments like, well, Amber, equity is not just race. And I understand it because, Nikole was saying that earlier, but there is a time, and that time apparently is now. And I'm grappling with why now, but isolating race and what that means in particular to anti-Blackness. And when we talk about Black and I understand my positionality as a Black woman coming in that space in a predominantly white environment and speaking to race, that I can be seen as a threat, or I can be seen as that I have a hidden agenda, or I'm being sensitive. We have to do this shift from that it's a Black and brown people's issue to like, this is everyone's issue. So racism is harming white people as well. You don't see it, so you're not benefiting from this system that was created to benefit you. Like, there is causing you harm as well. So I think that's something that we need to focus on when I do my trainings and I talk about like how we have to do this work together. And you can see this light bulb go off, and a lot of the white educators, predominantly white educators, are coming to my trainings because we don't have a lot of people of color. And they're like, I didn't realize that I had a stake in this, that it was my work too. I thought it was all on you. And that is what I see in the hope that I have of this shift that's coming. But again, I'm not gonna front, like I'm side-eyeing. I'm side-eyeing being like, are you doing it to be performative, to that you don't look racist? Because when we confront people, right, what they do is we'll do the tears, we'll do the defensive posturing, we'll do anything to center ourselves. And I'm talking predominantly about white people. You will center yourselves in the conversation when we bring up race. So now we're in this shift where you have to center our experience, and that is very difficult for you to give up on. So how are you going to make that shift? And that defensive posturing has been so problematic for so long, and that's why we've been quiet and been silent and been having this bridled anger, like having to keep it in, because when we speak our truth, like Mindy was saying, like, believe us, and you don't believe us. So now it's this light bulb moment where you're believing what we say. And for the friends that I have that I consider close, some that I even done anti-racism work with, the fact that you don't see that pain or haven't reached out to me, I'm wondering, I'm grappling with where do you really fit, and how do I then navigate interacting with you now? I've already had that, right? We already have those questions as people of color, marginalized groups, like how are you viewing me? And now it's just even more amplified. And that's where I'm struggling as far as being in the educational system and re-entry and all these things, like the anxiety of going back and being like, where are we?
Like, the reality is there's such a deep personal feeling and experiences on so many different levels that are being centralized right now, but there's so much bookend on every side. I mean, the reality is, predating in the design of our school districts is very compelling, that a lot of the school redistricting process where we went from 2,000 to 500 with very strange lines formations happened right after the Green Supreme Court case, which was the enforcement of Brown versus Board of Education. It really is a compelling argument that our school districts are by nature designed initially for school segregation. And that's a very powerfully complemented by, like, the most recent report by Research for Action, which shows the highest level of segregated school opportunity is happening here in Pennsylvania and in Massachusetts, which also have very compelling histories as far as school segregation. And then when we look to the future piece of it, again, like, I know Dana gets tired of me talking about these things because we talk about like future of work research pretty often, but if you look to the World Economic Forum from 2017, 18, and this most recent year, their biggest concern is not COVID. Their biggest concern is not nuclear war or climate change. It's inequality. That is one of the biggest things as far as global risk. And we know what global risk looks like if you drill it down. That's economic instability as far as wide swinging in our economic markets. As we've seen today, we see larger social unrest as we see today. We understand what inequality looks like as it plays out in front of us. This information, yes, it's been in front of us for decades. Telling that's going to culminate into something that looks a lot like now, that's been on the warning signs for leading leaders of government and industry for years at least. And then it's felt in such a deeply personal way every time. I think understanding the balance between the interplay of the system to our own beliefs, to all the different biases that come up in the interactions that happen. This is a very important tool for educators to master if they're going to effectively do some of this work. And we could stay on this question for almost the whole day, I'm sure. But what do you feel are the central issues regarding equity that students face in education? I think we're already starting to touch on that. Dana, Amber, I know that you have both been doing a lot of direct work with students when it comes to this kind of work. Can you guys speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so in terms of issues that students are facing, I think the things we're seeing in the global news right now, in terms of their lives at home, their interactions with the police, so you could, tick off those lists of things that you look at. I think some of the subtle things that we're gonna need to name are those interactions with teachers, those interactions with authority figures, those interactions with ourselves as school counselors, and thinking, like, seeing through the lens of our students, our marginalized students across the board, and what school looks like for them. So depending on your school demographics, it could be really unique. I also want to talk about kind of some of the school counselor things, that some of the issues that happen with equity that are like underneath the surface, depending on your school structure. So in some schools, there's a lot of structure with things as subtle as like schedule changes, but there's like this appeal process, and seeing the inequity behind the scenes that the students don't get to see, or say discipline practices, right? Like the result of discipline is confidential to the family. So it's hard for sometimes outsiders, besides the initial like contact. We have the data and the numbers on those, but some of the behind the scenes stuff of administration's decisions are really inequitable, and it's not intended to be. And it's hard to call out because those things are supposed to be confidential. So those are some subtle things that I challenge you to start to look at in your own, like finding your own issues in your own school, is starting to take note of some of the places that aren't so obvious, that aren't in the national conversation, that are happening behind the scenes, where some want kids given grace and another kid not given grace, that really we get to see, and often have a voice for, in not as obvious of a way.
Speaking to that a bit, I mean, there's, I think it gets back to a little bit of, there are a lot of implicit biases. And so when I think about this issue, you talk about issues that centrally impact equity, I think of the lack of opportunity. I think of the differential way that staff treat students from a very, very young age on. I can think of an example. I know, I'm just going to use mathematics as an example. I know that there are opportunities that when you look at enrollment in higher level math classes at the middle school and high school level, I know that there are patterns that seem to emerge that people are mystified by, that there are certain populations that don't ever seem to be well represented in those higher level math classes. And the response, it's interesting because it reflects that, it reflects the lack of reflection. There's not that stepping back and going, why is this happening? The response is, well, we had this placement test and kids just didn't do well on it. And so placement tests are fine. They're very, you can't get much more equitable than a placement test. You either do well or you don't. And it sifts you out nicely like that. And the question that we've been pushing and asking is, say, okay, let's say for the sake of argument that you're 100% right, that test is absolutely equitable in its design. The question that I'm going to ask you is, every educational opportunity leading up to the point at which that student took that test, were those equitable? Were those students given extra opportunities? Did the teacher spend a little bit more time with them? Did they take that little extra time that they did with different populations or not? Or were assumptions, perhaps not even at a conscious level, made about who's likely to do well or not in math? And so I treat you differentially throughout kindergarten, first grade, second grade, through all the way up to the point at which you actually take that placement test that gets you into that higher level math, which gives you that greater access. And I think that becomes a conversation that needs to happen, that doesn't often happen, that people aren't reflecting on. There's actually an amazing school psychologist named Celeste Malone on faculty at Howard University, and she did a training here in Pennsylvania at Temple. Spent a lot of time working with NASP. And one of the things that she's been promoting is that we use a series of guiding questions whenever we make any policy decision about anything, that says, what are the intended consequences of this decision we're making? And what are the unintended consequences? And what are the unintended consequences for certain populations? And how are we considering what that means for them? And so when we're thinking about how do you get into higher level math, and we say, well, there's a placement test. Well, yeah, what is the unintended consequences for minoritized populations? Have we not reflected on the fact that we have done something systematically all along that has created a barrier for them, that they are not able to do that well, and they're consequently a little bit further behind or denied an opportunity because of things that happened long before that test was ever given. And that's even just talking academics. I mean, if you want to get into behavior and disproportionality there and special education referrals, I mean, that's a huge can of worms. But I mean, those are things that you can see. People will literally have a group of students in front of them and who are all misbehaving. And there are certain students that get called out for misbehaving among those 5 or 6 kids. Well, you 3, come here. The rest of you, go along. Well, why those 3? Well, you know, they have a history. Well, do they really have a history? What is their history? Is their history actually assumed or not? And I think that there's a lot of that happens that we need to be reflecting on and being willing, as Amber pointed out, to really have those difficult conversations and recognize our role in perpetuating those practices, and being willing to say, look, no, this is not okay. We need to be able to turn the lens back on ourselves.
It's an excellent point. I know when Dana and I do trainings for counselors, we really talk about seeing classes as part of a pipeline experience. And reality is that the pipeline has been wholly and sieved for many of our students in very particular ways, but very much we can say now, during and after school closures, it's not a sieve. There are large holes, which really I want to jump into our next question right now, which is like, what are the key equity issues that students face as a result of COVID?
I would love to touch on this because it's something that as a school, as we're closing out this school year, I've asked for a lot of data around grading. And I know that through social media and keeping in touch with other high schools throughout the country, one of the primary concerns for the 4th quarter or 2nd semester is grading. And because students' grades are a reflection of what exactly the 2nd semester, right? It might not have been what they were a reflection of when we were all in the school building, and we could sort of level the playing field a bit because we had a little bit more control over the environments in which students were learning. And so I think grading has been a huge concern. And so we've pulled a lot of data to compare previous school years with this school year, been in touch with teachers about what their grading looks like and the information that they're getting from students, whether or not we've been able to even communicate with students at all. You know, so all of this has been influencing how we're moving forward, because we know, and I know as a high school counselor, that those grades are going to go on their transcript, right? When we're thinking about this pipeline, their grades are going to go on their transcript, and that transcript is going to provide them access to certain universities or colleges or merit awards. And so all of these things, you know, I'm thinking about, you know, even for our 9th and 10th graders, right? And so I know we have been using the resource of Grading for Equity by Joe Feldman, which we've found pretty helpful. We're still looking into and analyzing the data, asking relevant and important questions about the data that we do collect to make sure that we're capturing what we intend to capture, so that we can make changes or address needs ongoing throughout the summer. Because even though the school year is pretty much over, I think we're still seeing, you know, through June and July, some things that we've missed and that we need to make sure truly represent what the student has learned or truly represents what the student will be able to do in the fall, and not leaving a single student out, making sure that not a single student falls through the cracks, because, you know, that's why we're there, essentially.
That's awesome. Just to be clear, like I hear in Alicia's language right now, two of the central points when it comes to anti-racism work, particularly for educators, is to know the story. In this case, the data and history create very powerful stories. And the second part is to identify people as people. Sometimes we as humans get horribly confused where we will dehumanize students or people and then add humanistic characteristics to things or policies or procedures or systems. And it's, if you can hear those tones in the language coming out, it's probably not an equitable policy. It's probably not an equitable practice if we're prioritizing things like things or concepts in front of the human beings that are going to be in front of you 180 days a year. But are there any other thoughts as far as the equitable impact as far as students during COVID?
So Steve, part of what I'm thinking about, and I know in talking with Amber and Jason, as we think about reentry from COVID, is the amount of either mental health, trauma, grief, other things that might be on the plate of our young people, and in particular, our Black students who have had to endure this current climate at this point. So when we think about reentry and what does that look like from a student support services lens, I think we need to be cognizant that we need to give grace, as I heard Dana talk about. In particular, when we think about how we're identifying, as Steve put it, those students, not this group and representing this piece, but these students, and how we're identifying them for whatever services they might need. So for instance, what I'm thinking about, because I'm a school psychologist by training, is those potential referrals for special education that will come very quickly, whether that's academically or for emotional supports of some kind, where people will automatically assume these students are acting out and we don't know what to do and they need special ed. And we need to give that grace, that time for our young people to have the interventions they need, for us to wrap around them, to see if they can respond to those interventions properly before we make some of those long-lasting decisions that ultimately lead to the disproportionality that we're seeing. So my charge, as I'm talking with our leaders that are on this call, is that we really just need to be cognizant in supporting our practitioners to really think about those wraparound services, trauma, mental health. That's equity in and of itself.
I think the one part is just understanding that unique balance that education has. And education absolutely is a tool for tremendous opportunity. And you don't have to scratch the surface to know that it has been and continues to be a system of oppression simultaneously. And to truly to afford yourself in the knowledge that that is the case helps, I think, to navigate those spaces. Are there any other thoughts as far as supporting students during or after COVID?
I think, Steve, that last thing you said, and then Nikole, you kind of segued into that, but my thing is when you're looking at it, every one of those calls saying we understand that education was not built for people that look like me. So there's a system of oppression that's going on. So when we're thinking about how do we support our students, I think we think about it within that structure of what education looks like now. And we got to blow that structure out. Like, I mean, and I think COVID has helped us to see like this is not working. It hasn't worked. So when we're thinking about what can we do, and I talk to our students and our staff, and they're like, well, we won't be able to do that because of X, Y, and Z. I said, don't think about the structure. We have to get rid of that. So what do you need, period? And then we need to make it happen. Like, forget the system's broken. So we have to think about it in those terms, like forget that within those parameters, no parameters.
And even with that, in terms of like I've been reflecting on that in terms of the system, over what we like immediately have power. Like, how do I help my fellow counselors think about like if next year ends up being a blended format, or we go back and then we come back again, like who knows what the next, until there's a vaccine, what things are going to look like with COVID. But even how do we reinvent, like instead of just taking what services we offer and say, how do we change it to online? Say, whoa, what is our program, our school counseling program, actually need to look like. Let's not just try to create what we do in the building in an online format. It's a chance to reimagine what our program could look like as a whole. And so leading through that sort of design process is going to be, it's a unique opportunity. You know, and I'm personally looking for, you know, even professional development on how to lead a team through something like that. I'm not even the director, but just kind of thinking about that work.
Mindy, I saw you were about to say something.
Well, I'm just thinking as school counselors, and this might get off topic here, but we don't get to sit this out. And we're not waiting. I tell my counselors this all the time. We're not waiting for administrators to tell us what we should be doing. We're not waiting for our central office people, that's me, to tell you what you should be doing. You know your kids, you know your community, and we are trained to be leaders and advocates in school counseling. And we have an ethical responsibility to provide a comprehensive program for our kids and to be proactive. I realize the last 3 months have been reactive, all reactive. You know, anything that we had planned just kind of went to the wayside because we were all in a pandemic and we just needed to react. But we have time right now to plan. And so what I don't want us to be doing is chasing our tails in August and acting like we didn't know this was going to happen. We know what's coming and we know multiple scenarios. And so I think it's summer, you know, for us, this is our last week of school. Take the time that you need in summer to do your thing, to be reinvigorated, but also we can't just wait. And so we need to start thinking, how are we going to proactively get in front of these conversations about race with our kids, with ourselves? What are we going to do for ourselves to show up in a better place in the fall? And what are we doing with our programs? Because if you wait until September to think about it, you're way too late. And you're going to continue in this state of trauma, of constantly reacting. I've felt my cortisol levels are so high every day. I'm just like, I feel the adrenaline or something's going on. But you can't keep doing that. We're all going to burn out and crash. And so we have to be prepared, and we've got some time right now to prepare.
So when we talk about that preparation, what are the strategies or practices that educators, school counselors, school psychologists, what are some of those practices they should consider to promote equity or to address oppressive practices?
One of the places I say to start, if you're not sure where to start sometimes, is looking at your data. Your data is going to tell you exactly where your problems are. And you look at your data through that equity lens. You disaggregate that data. You disaggregate it by race, by socioeconomic status. You disaggregate it by special education services. And you're going to see that. And most of the time, counselors already know where those are. The data just supports what we already know. But sometimes the data helps us to get other people to listen to what we need to be doing and where we need to be focusing. We look at our AP courses, like Jason was saying, and the disproportionate number of students in certain classes. Look at your grades. Your principals can go in a grade book and see which teachers and how they're grading different students. And you can disaggregate a grade book by race to see where some of these, and sometimes it's implicit things that we don't even realize we're doing. And so we've got to be ready to do that. And then we have to be ready to start looking at ourselves and reflecting on what we're doing. And a lot of us are doing a lot of harm to a lot of kids unintentionally. And we've got to be ready to listen when people tell us that we're doing that and not get fragile about it and not get defensive about it and reflect on it and do better. I was in a protest this weekend and I said, what's the Maya Angelou quote? Now I'm going to go blank, but when you know better, do better. And it's time for us to do better because we all know better now.
Just to speak to that, I mean, like one of the trappings that we can get to in narrative is to support some of these racist narratives that's always been. A lot of that will be the deficiency of our students. Like we'll use the narrative to say that these behavioral problems with these students of color are because these students of color have behavioral problems, and not really look to the system. As school counselors, we're trained to be systems level change agents, and we need to ask the questions as far as what the system is doing. It's either the students are deficient and they have problems, and that's lending itself to some of these historic racist narratives, or it is that there are things that we could do actively in the system, either in the now or there are problems in the pipeline experience that could better support our students, and we need to actively identify those things. Those are two separate narratives and two different ways of looking and addressing the data.
Yeah, I'd like to,
Go ahead.
So I was actually going to go back to something that Dr. Sessoms did say earlier in answering two different questions. And part of that is unlearning so much of what we have learned as adults, as probably people who have done well in the traditional school system that we were a part of. Elementary, middle, high school, like always gotten fantastic grades. I've always benefited from the structure that I currently am in my school, and that is to say that I will likely perpetuate that same system because I benefited from the way that was done. But I think we have to unlearn so much of that so that we can reach every single student in the way that they need to be reached. Also, and that's difficult, right? Because it's like you don't know what you don't know. But I think part of what educators who are not people of color, who are not Black educators, can really be much more intentional about listening to, learning from, reading, attending webinars and, such as this and other educational experiences where they're learning from people of color, Black, Indigenous people. I think that's part of that unlearning process, part of that unlearning the problematic traditions of our society, because people of color, Black people, Indigenous people have a perspective that is often not included. And so I think by learning from us, there is a way to sort of capture what hasn't necessarily benefited students.
Yeah, such a great point that I think what you're both, talking about, the historicity of race and how we leave that out of the conversation. So when we can erase that history, when we can, do this whole historical revisionism, it leaves out our story and then it turns into these tropes and these stereotypes. And I know when I was doing my dissertation, I remember my chair at the time, who turned out to not be my chair after she made these comments. She's like, I don't see the relevance of you putting the history of racism and these archetypes in your research. And I had to explain to her why that was so relevant, because they still play out today. This Jezebel, this mammy stereotype, like all these things of picking, all these things still play out today. So that was coming out of Reconstruction and all these images that they wanted to perpetuate and portray us as. So when you leave out the history and you say, oh, well, yeah, there was slavery, but it wasn't that bad. They were happy. I mean, we have teachers that are going around having kids pick cotton and dancing around like happy little slaves because we want to create this narrative that we were better off. Like, wait, that's the same reason why like Jim Crow and all that happened, because it was like, you were better off when you were enslaved, when you were property. So it still plays out today. And if we escape that, then we can look at these kids and be like, and see that they're inferior and see all these things that are playing out because we don't have that knowledge. And we as Black people, guess what? We had to learn that ourselves because we don't learn it in school. So do the work, learn it, but learn it in a sense where you're not doing it to make yourself feel less guilty about your whiteness. Like, I don't need that from you. Like, what are you going to do with that to move it forward and say, I see you completely and fully for who you are, and I see how the system has silenced you and made you into this trope that I perpetuated, and now I'm deconstructing it, and now we have to look at the system differently. Like that, I'm gonna stop there because then my blood pressure's going up.
Oh, that was a great statement. Ha, joke. Just taking a time out. When we talk about some of the language that we're using right now, we're talking about anti-oppression work, and we talk about anti-racism, but anti-racism is one leg of any sort of intersectional anti-oppression work. The reality is when we talk about ways that oppression works, it's historically political, written into laws. More often than not, you can look to history and see that it's been upheld by things like violence and death in addition to that. It's also been wide scale and been under specific groups, and whether it be race, religion, age, gender, sexuality, nationality, and the last one, which is eluding me, ableism. Thank you. So these are different ways that we can understand historic oppression. From a teaching tool and from an advocacy tool, I always lean towards race, not just because it's my lens, but it's also those general historical milestones that we can create multiple perspective views. There's just a broader lens there. There's a broader and common language that we can build off of that isn't as accessible with some of those other areas of intersectionality. Not that they don't exist, they're very much there, but more often everyone knows what slavery was, everyone knows what Jim Crow was, and we can use those as really powerful teaching moments for everyone.
Well, and I'd like to add a little bit of, what some of that, like we've been talking about looking at equity from a lens on marginalized students and how, or other marginalized population and poverty. But another thing that I'm stewing over too is how do we also disrupt the miseducation of our white students. That's been happening as well. And what's the role of that? I think for school counselors in schools that get to go in and do classroom lessons really need to spend some time looking at that of like what are your lessons and how are you disrupting past miseducation about these issues and system of oppression. What books are you using in elementary school on your lessons? Even if you have an all-white school, you can read a book with centering Black bodies. You can read a book centering other marginalized populations and these stories. And so that is a really great place to start, especially those of us that are pushing into classrooms as well. It's about equity and policy, but it's also, I think what we're learning too is about our white students and what are they learning as well, like what misinformation have they gotten and where can we help fix that.
Dan, I think you're talking a bit about representation in the curriculum and how are folks represented in the curriculum. I mean, to Amber's point, for how many students does the conceptualization of Black people and their place in society begin and end with the Civil War and framed within the context of slavery, as if nothing happened before or after? That was it. It hit, and I think that there's a lot of the way that curricula are structured, materials are chosen, et cetera, that perpetuate that and perpetuate people's thinking in that regard. And I will confess, I'm by no means I'm very much on this journey myself, and I will not claim anything other than that. But it is astounding to me when you take a step back and you look at that and go, yeah, for how many people? And I would argue, Amber, that there are a lot of people, I think you made a comment about a lot of people know about slavery and Jim Crow. I would argue that a lot of people who, when you say Jim Crow, have no idea what you're referring to.
They definitely know about lynching, which blows my mind.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of that people don't even make the connection. I mean, you just look at you can look at pop culture for the last 60 years. I'm just going to use that as a window to see that there are things that are embedded in that people have no idea to what that's referring. I think I may have mentioned to some of you the movie White Christmas. People love it. It's a great Christmas movie. They think it's great. And there's a section of that, there's a musical number that is completely racist that people have no idea. It's all about minstrel shows. That's the title of the song. And they're not in blackface, but they're wearing red gloves. And it's like, it's just slightly different. And people have no concept that. I mean, we were watching it and I looked at my daughter and I said, do you know what they're referring to there? She's like, what do you mean? I said, that's a minstrel show. And so we had to go through and have this whole lengthy conversation about the history of it. So I think when you're talking about from an educational point of view, are we talking about the history? Because people don't have a context. And I think people tend to dismiss, and by people, I'll just say white people, tend to dismiss concerns, issues, et cetera, because they think it's such an ancient history thing and that there's nothing about this is current, and they don't have a context for it, and they don't even recognize what they're engaging in, or what they're consuming and how it contributes to just continued oppression and continued racism. They just don't get it.
I think there's so much of a narrative that, again, is absent for so many of our students and our educators and our community members across the education system. But right now, we have a very shared collective narrative that's happening through the school closures to many public events, including these racial bias instances, police-related violence. How these and similar incidents impact students in schools?
I think it's really important that we have to think about, when I have these conversations with my white colleagues in particular, that I ask them, how often have you seen white people be murdered on TV? And it's just, it gives them pause, and they're like, oh my God. And, you know, my older friends will say JFK, you know, RFK, but I'm like, that is so problematic, that how we look at Black bodies, and how it's just, it is okay to continue to show that on TV. And I think what the difference is, like, we don't realize for Black people, when I see that, how that is re-traumatizing, like the trauma that I already have to experience every day and feeling the level of unsafety. But when I see that, I'm looking like, that is my husband, that is my brother, that is my dad, that is me. And I think that's the difference when you look at it, you're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe what they did to George Floyd. Like, that is so horrible. But that is a very real lived reality and experience for us. And I think that is so problematic. So when we're seeing this on TV and our kids are seeing that, and I won't watch it, I will not, I can't do it. But I've talked to my Black friends that have watched it, and they're like, it is, they force themselves to watch it. They're like, Amber, there's no way around it. Because that goes back to my question about why now. But what they tell me is, there's no way that you can make an excuse for what they did. And then, but then I think, but we make excuses all the time for all the other cases. So that goes to me, that racist ideology. Like, why do we always go to making excuses first? So there's so much to unpack there, but the trauma that we keep subjecting to our Black and brown people about seeing these bodies, even when you think about the man and his child when they washed up on shore and they just showed their bodies floating as they drowned. Why do we keep doing that? And I get, like, if you hadn't seen that video, right, there would be no conviction, because we make excuses, because that is just our reality. Like, we're disposable. But it causes so much more harm to us witnessing that over and over and over again. It's that racial trauma that Dr. Monica Williams talks about from UConn. That is real. It's like PTSD.
I think just kind of taking it through the lens of trauma, though, there are a range of trauma experiences in the same way, even for white people. Like, seeing these videos, they have, like, a trauma response is, again, it's disconnection. It is separating. And so, like, to try and disconnect and pull yourself away from that narrative to come up with something else, where is it? Larry Davis's book, Why Are They Angry? Why Are They Always Angry at Us? Is a really great read to talk about that cognitive dissonance and where there's a response of anger and disbelief when you see these collective trauma experiences, because denial is also a part of a trauma response sometimes. And the reality is, like, you can watch any of these videos, you can read it and just feel like this could be prevented. This could have been avoided, and we could have something better. So yeah, I definitely echo that there's a collective trauma experience, whether it be through COVID or these very public deaths, or even in addition to that, these assaults where there's attacks on people that you're directly related to, people you know, or just the basic humanity, where people are leaving their homes and possibly facing death for walking a dog, or letting people know that we don't want this situation to escalate. I'm a concealed and carried member, or I have my cell phone out at a party, or any number of things. But what are some of the other urgencies when it comes to these very public out-of-school events and how they impact our students in schools?
So I've seen for our student population, we are geographically, very close to Washington, D.C. So our school is in Prince George's County, but we're 10 minutes from the Capitol. And so our students have really close access. And they have historically been very active in movements and protesting, and we took them out in the fall for climate change protests. This particular time feels a little bit different for them. It feels a little bit more violent, and not necessarily on the part of the protesters. So our students are a little bit more cautious about exercising their right to protest, which, can arguably, the statement can be made that is intentional. And so I think our students are really grappling with that. They're grappling with the responses that they're seeing from school leadership. They're grappling with the responses that they see from the colleges and universities that they are planning to attend in the fall, and whether or not statements have been released about that particular institution's position on what is happening currently. They're grappling with some of the comments that their teachers have made about the protests and about the protesters, and characterizations made about the protesters versus the police, who have been incredibly active in terms of, arresting peaceful protesters in DC. So I think that our students are taking all of it in a way, because they're not necessarily, essentially they're too afraid to come into the district and protest themselves. And so they're observing from a distance, and they're really concerned about some of the responses that they have been seeing from citywide leadership, and some of the adults in their lives.
Jason, can you talk a little bit, or any of our ASP members, as far as the crafting of a public response when it comes to an organization? Or Mindy, yeah.
Sure, I can jump in. Yeah, I know that just over the weekend, the Association of School Psychologists of Pennsylvania released our statement on this issue, social justice and anti-racism, just because we've been doing social justice work for a while, but this seemed to be this called for a very specific response. And I think that part of the way we crafted the message was in the context of this current time, but also saying, look, this can't just be another laundry list that you say, yeah, I'm fired up now, and then it's done. So we've actually called for folks to do something, to be active, to take the next steps, to try to educate their students, educate their staffs, educate themselves. Don't be afraid to do something for yourself, to find out for yourself, to learn more for yourself, to understand what white privilege is, to understand race. Anything you could. I should have been taking notes today. There were things I'm like, I want to go check on that afterwards, but not to be afraid to look and to try to do this work, and to really try to be preventative and proactive. We need to know that we are dealing with trauma responses. And the interesting thing is we're dealing with a couple of trauma responses right now that we're gonna have to be prepared for in the fall. We have to deal with the COVID trauma response. We have to deal with the traumatic response for our minoritized populations related to this, as well as our white students and other students related to this, as well as the fact that there has been longstanding trauma due to racism, period, that has gone unchecked for years. And that needs to be something we need to be mindful of and address. And so in crafting that, our message we put out was like, look, we need to do this. We need to be taking a stand as advocates, because that's what, as student service professionals, as school-based mental health providers, that's what we do. We advocate for our students and families. And this is something we need to be conscious of, and it needs to be in the front and center for the work that we're doing moving forward. Because that is a benefit to all students, to all of us, if we are doing this work better. If we raise all boats, that is a good thing for us as a society. So we need to make sure that we are taking those steps and being proactive. And so that's part of what we did. To echo a little bit about what Alicia was saying, is I think that the concern we have is by not putting the statement out, is what you're going to have is, and I think you've seen a little bit of it now, thankfully, I think it's been stemmed, but you see a lot of people trying to explain away the protests, explain away the anger, saying that violence is, protests are bad, or looting is bad. And I actually sent a message to somebody because I was just stunned, because they said it's terrible that they're looting. People are looting. That's awful. And I want to go, wait, let me get this straight. Let me see if I understand this perspective 100%. You're posting and being outraged by looting. That's the part that you have a problem with. Property destruction. And I'm not, property destruction is bad, don't get me wrong. But I think about what I'm a parent. What is the first thing I tell my child if there's a fire? Get yourself out, take care of yourself. The stuff is replaceable. And yet we're outraged by looting, but not by the death of a human being that can't be replaced, that has happened. Yes, this is the most recent example, but this is what we're outraged by. We're not outraged by that, by the unnecessary killing of our citizens. We're outraged by the fact that this store has been broken into and that person's livelihood has been impacted. Yes, guess what? Somebody's livelihood is impacted because they're dead now unnecessarily. That is a huge loss. Stuff can be replaced. And so I think that that's something, as we're looking at these issues, we need to be mindful, and that we can't just let people explain away, which is why we put out our statement. It can't be just push it off. Okay, we're going to deal with it for now. We're going to be really upset, and we're going to do lots of things online, and we're going to click on every petition that comes out, and we're going to do our virtual activism as opposed to our actual activism. And that's what I think that our statement is trying to get people to do. Say, look, you need to do something different. And we want to offer you some guidance in terms of how to do that. We want to offer you help. We're going to be, and this is a long-standing journey. This is a marathon. This is not a sprint. We need to be doing this for years. And so that's part of the reason we crafted that statement, was we wanted to make sure that we were talking to our membership and anybody else who will listen to say, look, this is what we need you to be thinking about.
I've seen some statements that are, here's the laundry list of all the ways we've been doing this work for a long time. And I don't care about your laundry list. It's not working, right? And I also see many places that took way too long to put a statement out. I did a circle work with my counselors, and we have 20% of our counselors are Black counselors. And just Thursday, I was like, look, we got an agenda. It's the end of the school year. We got stuff we got to talk about, but we're not doing any of that right now because we can't function in a meeting. I mean, we're not talking about schedule changes right now. We need to stop and talk about this. How are you? And after I got off that call, I called the executive director of WSCA and I said, we have to put something out immediately. Immediately, we have to condemn this. Our counselors are looking for us. If your state association hasn't put something out yet, you are way behind, and something needs to get out. And I don't want to see a list of all the things you've already been doing. I want to see a list of your commitments from here on out. And I want to see, at a minimum, that you're condemning what's happening, the violence against Black people, and you're calling out school counselors to do something. I'll say it again, you don't get to sit back. If you're sitting back as a school counselor, please find another job, because I don't want to be associated with other people in this profession that are not doing anything right now. It is your ethical and moral responsibility to do something. You're in the wrong profession if you're not. I saw, and then with my counselors in our district, we're going to put out our own commitments, and Wednesday's our last day of school. So I'm trying to do this in a quick way, but also in a well thought out way. We already went back and reimagined our vision statement to make sure it was very clear in our vision statement and our mission statement of the equity work and our commitment to that. And then I had the counselors start reflecting on what are our personal commitments and what are our commitments as a district. And because kids are waiting to hear from us. And our colleagues want to hear from us. What are we doing as school counselors about this? What are we committed to doing? Even if it is one thing, I'm going to read some books and I'm going to open my eyes to stuff that I've been blind to. What is it? I saw Virginia School Counseling Association. They had a really nice statement and it was very explicit. Trish Hatching results came out, and that one I liked it because it was in your face. Like, you're complicit if you're doing these things. And these are the exact ways that you can do better as a school counselor, and you need to start doing better as school counselors. And so I appreciate the boldness of some of those statements, because I think it's important. Now is not a time for PR games. It's not a time to dance around things. We've got to be very clear of our commitment here. And I'm worried that, right now I'm worried that we're sprinting, and this is a marathon, and we've got to make sure that we're committed to not doing this work just for the next couple of weeks while it's trending, but we're doing this work. I'm going to come back to this in 3 months, and I'm going to hold people accountable to some of these things that we've committed to doing. I'm working on a professional development plan for my counselors this summer, and this is going to be a part of it all year. We're not going to stop this work, and we can't stop. But I fear that the way our society works right now, it's what's going to be the end thing for everybody to get fired up about next month, right? And so it's been month by month. We've had some other major event, and we've got to make sure that this momentum doesn't stop and that we continue, because it's going to take us a long time to get it where we need to get it, and we can't stop until it's there.
Yeah. Earlier on, I did put out officially from my role as far as the PSCA president-elect a statement. And really, I think part of it was calling on the work that we've been doing here in Pennsylvania, which is that state associations should adopt an equity policy. And I think it just makes sense. So you, in the same way, don't talk about what you did, but talk about how you have a structured plan as far as what you are doing and continuing to do. I think that's something that's imperative. And it's all those things that Jason said before, having a structured plan for ongoing professional development or training, defining what equity and disparity looks like in education through the lens of your field. And in addition to that, committing to developing ongoing educational resources. And in addition to that, to looking at your own data. A lot of our state associations, unfortunately, are tiered in a way that lends itself to privilege. And they'll say that it is commitment, but the reality is that we have counselors who are supported by their districts and counselors who are not. We have counselors who have the ability to afford. We have counselors that have caseloads of like 1,500 and are just trying to get through a week. I know that the same could be said for psychologists as well. I definitely encourage the adoption of policies. I definitely encourage like cross-discipline practices. And again, in addition to that, like commitment, again, not to just to put a statement out there, but like Mindy, as you were saying, to do the work. And that's an ongoing process. And yes, those first steps are going to feel hard. It's going to feel like you're doing a sprint, but there's a long road ahead. So I guess my question to the group as we're winding down is really, if you had a suggestion as where people could get started either with themselves, their school, or their profession, what would be something? Let's just roundtable it as we did from the start, if Dana, if you were to kick it off.
Can Nikole go first?
Could we roundtable because Nikole has a timely meeting? Yes.
Awesome. Thank you, Dana. So some of the resources that I think are important to touch base around are teaching tolerance. It's the first one I always go to, and Alicia spoke about that earlier, so that's awesome. But I'm finding that to be really, really timely, and the work that's coming out is really, really crucial. The other one would be the Leading Equity Center from Dr. Sheldon Akins. If you visit that website, leadingequitycenter.org, I think, .org or .com, you'll find it. But he has a plethora of resources and has been extremely responsive through podcasts, through articles, through different types of platforms that have been really useful. And last but not least, our PaTTAN system. If you visit www.PaTTAN.net and go to the multi-tiered system of support tab and the equity section, I've been able to personally populate that, as well as our behavior continuity of educational resources. So I have more, but I don't want to take any more time from you guys. So those would be my top three.
Who's next? Dana?
Yeah, so there's like a lot of new things that are like sold out, right? Like Ibram Kendi's work, Stamped, and How to Be Anti-Racist and things like that. So I think like the things that I'll bring to light in this conversation and rise to the surface is potentially, like looking at works by Angela Davis. So, continuing to center Black voices and female voices in this as well. Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria was written in the 90s. So, there's a lot of updating, but that book gives a lot of foundational kind of research into anti-racism and the psychology of racism and things like that. So kind of lifting up maybe some things that aren't getting as much media attention right now.
We didn't update it last year, so there is
there's a new edition of that. That's awesome. So those would be a couple that I'll highlight besides all the other great ones you're probably already seeing.
And Stamped from the Beginning, Ibram Kendi's National Book Award winner, is available on most free library apps. Yeah. So you could pay $0 to 0 cents and then have someone speak it to you. What are some other ideas out there?
I'll speak from my lens. White fragility rocked my world. And if you're going to start somewhere and you're white and you're doing this work, that one I thought was, it called me up and made me really rethink a lot of things and realize things that I was doing that I didn't realize I was doing. My favorite chapter is the White Lady's Tears. And so there's a whole chapter on White Lady's Tears because we're real good at crying and diverting attention back to us. And it was just, I was crying as I'm reading it. But I just think right now there's so many resources. There's webinars coming at us, there's emails, and we're getting saturated. So I think find one thing right now to just, if you're beginning this work, find one thing, one book study, and then just really start doing some of that personal work and that personal reflection. The other thing they talk about in White Fragility is having another white person who's doing this work with you to call you out on these things. It is not my Black colleagues or my Black friends' job to call me out, or for me to ask them, how am I doing? Am I doing okay with this? It's not their job. But I need to call my white colleague and say, Dana, how did that go? And she should give me the feedback, because this is our job. It's our problem to fix here. And so we've got to show up and do that. And part of that is educating ourselves and really reflecting and thinking about who we are as people, and unlearning all of those things that I've learned for the last 40 years. I've got to start unlearning. And it's tough, but we've got to do the work. Our kids' lives depend on it.
I think for me, I was able to do the Courageous Conversations on race through Pacific Education Group. That training, they do have a book. There's a newer edition. It's actually blue. So this one here is on Amazon. But what I really appreciate about that is that there's tools in there, and there's ways that you can actually look at implementing it. And it really focuses on part of it, which I really respect, is that they talk about your racial autobiography. So when I do this work, I will do it with a white colleague. And what I found is, as a Black woman, I can very easily, like, we can see race, like we have to live it, we talk about it, we have a racialized discourse, but white people don't have that discourse. So when I talk about it, it's kind of like, oh yeah, Amber's talking about her race, and like people can understand it because we talk about it. But when she talks about it, I could see this shift, and they're like, oh, I had never considered that. Or now, when is your first time that you had to really think about race? All these things that they talk about, and it's also about centering the other person. So when you're seeing, for example, I have a colleague that we have very tough conversations, courageous conversations. So the one in particular, he says to me, well, after Reconstruction, he's like, there were poor white people and there were poor Black people. So poor white people made it, why didn't Black people? And I'm like, well, because there's something still called racism. And then I had to talk to him about, Black Wall Street and all these things that people are now starting to realize, like how we had our own cities and they burned them to the ground. We had our own banks, all these things that they didn't realize. So what I saw from him was he was intellectualizing it, right? Like he's a chemistry person. So he's like, that's a real science, not psychology. So because he was intellectualizing it, I was able to meet where he was and say, well, here's the actual research, or here's the actual like history of that. So he went back and read it, and he's like, oh, his mind was blown. He had no idea. So it shows you how to center that person and see where they're at, and then try to meet them where they're at. Because sometimes we want to bring them to our side, right? We don't want to center that now. But so I think that's a great resource. And I also will say, I think we need to start partnering with our local colleges. We don't do enough of that work because, if you look at Southern Poverty Law Center, and you'll see that there is no, like, we don't have that background knowledge of African-American history, Black history. So partnering with Black studies, African-American studies with the local professors, I think can really help us to shift and start looking at things through what Steve was talking about, that language. So talking about Stuart Hall and looking at the connoted and denoted meaning behind words and that racialized discourse, I think is really important, and that you have to really fine tune that. And I think that these professors that do this work every day can help us in some of that. And Bell Hooks, she's like, engage pedagogy all day. So it talks about positionality, our positionality as educators, and how we bring that into the classroom, and how do we engage our students.
Jason, Alicia?
Yeah, sure. So definitely what helped shift my thinking about this work was Pedagogy of the Oppressed. That's kind of like a book to really get you thinking outside of the traditional education system, education thinking in this country, even though I believe the author was from South America somewhere. But I still think that it's totally, what did you say, Amber?
Mary?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so that is definitely a text that helped shift my thinking. I am a huge proponent of following certain people on social media. because there's constantly sharing of resources, information. It's how I was able to connect with different people all over the country, all over the world about anti-racism work. I think that as a Black woman, there's a certain parts of this work I need a little bit something different than white colleagues. Having conversations with Black counselors around colorism and intersectionality and all sorts of things that are not necessarily conversations that I would have with white colleagues, at least not at the stage where I am currently. So I think, social media has been a great entry point for me to have some of those conversations with others, start those conversations and get resources. It's important to follow certain people, though. I want to encourage people not to be too disillusioned with some educators who have 1 million followers and lots of people are, liking and retweeting. Just be critical in your thinking about what you see. But ultimately, there's a ton of resource sharing on Twitter in particular, and I find that to be pretty helpful.
From my lens, I would echo a little bit of what everybody said, teaching tolerance, white fragility. But I think to Mindy's point and a little bit to what Amber and Alicia were saying is, I think you kind of need to focus. There's a little bit of overload right now. And things are, there was a ton of stuff coming out. Everything was coming out COVID like 2 months ago. And now everything is coming out anti-racism. So I think you just need to pick a path and just start going down that. I'm not going to add any additional resources. I think everybody's covered everything, but I think you just need to start somewhere and just start moving through rather than be distracted by all the rest of it. Just go and do the reading, start doing the work, start down that path. That would be my recommendation.
Yeah, I would not find something personally, and then also look at your data and pick maybe something to start with your school's data. So you're doing maybe something personal, and then something about, if you're looking at discipline or you want to look at academic pipelines, you want to look at your curriculum, do kind of both pieces, but maybe pick one from each would be a recommendation I'd have to channel your time this summer.
I know, just kind of playing right off of that, made me think of Stuck in the Shallow End. I think that's a very powerful book for school counselors to read to help to understand the educational pipeline a little bit more. Just speaking from a different lens, it's coming out, I think, in the next month, July, I think. It's the Anti-Racist Educational Leadership and Policy book. Yeah, it's on hardbound, but it's $1 million, but it'll be coming out for, I think, $30 soon. I've had some chapter reviews of it. It seems like a really great tool for anyone who's in kind of these leadership spheres. So I might recommend you consider picking that one up. I'll be picking it up. But most importantly, I think one of the best things is to be very proactive and intentional about surrounding yourself with amazing colleagues to support you on this journey. That is absolutely how this call was created. So I do want to just kind of end just whipping around the room. What are you guys doing for your own self-care, particularly during these times?
I think you touched on it, Steve, just surrounding yourself with people that care, that see you truly and holistically for who you are is really important. And then I'll have, Nikole will say, we need to rest. It's time to rest. So, checking in and being sure that I'm not doing this and educating all the time, because that's what I want to do. I want to educate, but also saying that you have to do the work. So just being mindful of when I need to take a step away and take care of myself and center myself has really been important. But connecting with those who are like-minded in this time is really important because of where I am as far as my vulnerability and my pain. Just making sure that I'm having people that can hold space for that and just see me.
I am very fortunate to be in a location where I have access to a lot of amazing restaurants that are delivering these days. I like on one side of me is Adams Morgan, if you're familiar with DC. On the other side is Columbia Heights. I'm about 4 blocks away from U Street. So I am eating, and I'm eating food from all over the world. Yesterday we had brunch from this Filipino restaurant that was amazing. Tonight it'll probably be Thai. So I'm just enjoying food and taking my time to eat and just share that something that is culturally has always been culturally a very beautiful connecting experience, food. And so I am loving every minute of it these days.
I'll be over at 3:30. I'll sit 6 feet away.
I'm super jealous. Jason and I are like, wait, because we're like in the Hershey area, like, what?
Yeah.
I don't have any of that.
Yeah. Yeah, I used to live in DC, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I know exactly where she is.
Yes.
That's the sweet spot for food.
Oh, it's awesome. It's awesome.
So jealous. So jealous.
So as you're seething your jealousy, what are you doing to take care of yourself, Jason?
Oh, yeah. Well, now I have another thing to soothe myself about. I literally will just disconnect. I will shut the laptop. I will put it away. I've been listening to a lot more music than ever, spending time with my family. My wife is an amazing cook. I'm terrible, but I'm unskilled labor. So I'm very happy to help with all that. So we just are making meals and just enjoying each other. Spinning vinyl. Been listening to vinyl records.
We've been listening to.
I'm sorry?
You've been listening to.
Let's see. It's been weird. It's been very eclectic. So it went from Earth, Wind, and Fire to Devo, to the Go-Go's, to Don McLean. It's just to the Police, to it's all the Commodores. It's been everywhere. I mean, it's been fun. It's been like, oh wow, yeah, we've been listening and teaching my daughter how to put an album on a turntable and not wreck it is like, yeah, that's been a very interesting. I'm clearly the old guy in the group, right? Because I have very deep knowledge on how to handle a record. But yeah, it's been a lot of fun. So that's been great, being able to dig into all these old albums.
I imagine the mixtape of your life is fascinating.
Yeah. Well, as you might recall, my ringtone is the opening to Love Supreme. So we were in a meeting once and my phone went off and Steve goes, "That's Coltrane's Love Supreme." I'm like, "Yes, it is." Like nobody recognizes that, but he pulled it out. I was like, nice. I know I dig this guy.
Yeah. Dana, Mindy?
Go ahead, Dana.
I was gonna say, kind of pre George Floyd's murder and the social media outrage, I had already started kind of disconnecting a bit from social media. And I kind of like resetting some habits around that. My struggle around that right now is, that is where kind of some work happens, so just setting some intentional about how I engage in those spaces, and also figuring out that balance of like not having confirmation bias, but then not letting myself get riled up by seeing things that I don't agree with. So that's been, so I needed to make some healthy boundaries around that. And that was one of my self-care things, and that was about COVID initially. So it's kind of been weird to be in this sort of unplugged from social media space when this is happening, because it's not because it's happening, it was already happening. So I hang out with my toddler and really kind of engage with her. That's craziness and self-care, and sometimes I'm putting her little screaming body in her crib and walking away, but and other times it's a joy. Trying to be intentional where I am, and I think that's some of the disconnect in social media. It's like when I'm on social media, I want to like have a purpose of why I'm on, and when I'm with my family, I need to have that purpose. So those have been some of the boundaries and the lines that I've been doing for self-care.
I'm going to say it, wine. I've been drinking more than normal, if anybody knows me, if that's possible. But No, just enjoying trying new wines. I tried Roscato this week, and I'm not a sweet wine person typically, but Roscato, I don't like Moscato, so I tried a Roscato, so that's nice. So I've been trying some new things. I've been eating and working out and then eating some more and then working out again. But I have 3 young boys, and so I am just surviving at this point between work and the world. And some of the self-care for me is getting involved in my small community. I helped organize a protest that we did here. And for me, that was self-care because I feel like sometimes the weight of everything feels so much bigger than anything that I can do. What can I do? What can I do? And then I have all of this anxiety because there's things I want to do, but I need to channel that. And so I found there's a group we're in a suburb outside of Madison, and that has really come together, and we organized this beautiful event where our kids came and spoke, and we had student speakers, and we're a predominantly white community, and it was just really a challenge back to our community to really think and reflect and change and do better. And our Black community came out too, and it was beautiful, and that was self-care because I felt like I was able to make some sort of an impact with that. And we're going to continue with that momentum and doing what we can within our immediate area. And I brought my kids and got my kids involved. And this has really, been really good for us, I think, to come together as a community to push us to the next level and to really think about what we've been doing. But mainly I've been drinking.
Just speaking, not necessarily to the wine part, but just one of those final focusing points as far as like foundational anti-racism knowledge is make sure that you are intentional, including the voices of those who you most want to represent. And with this case, I can say in my own journey, student voice is one of the most powerful tools out there when it comes to social justice work. And again, that's why I think we as educators are uniquely positioned, particularly as school counselors and school psychologists, through our training and expertise to understand the data, to connect with those students and empower them, and in addition to use that to advocate for real systemic change. So please, Mindy, I know you're talking about wine and activism, but those sound like amazing things. I saw Dana took a sip as soon as you said wine.
Dana.
Of my water.
Of water. With all those things.
Wishful
We're not judging.
I built a pool. I've been swimming in a pool. It's really, really cold, but it's something to do.
Build a pool?
Build a pool, yeah. Talk to me later. We'll work something out. Absolutely. I want to thank all the listeners for being with us through this journey. I want to thank everyone who is on the call really for sharing their expertise, sharing their insights, sharing their passion for students and for the work. And I want to just thank you all for just being committed to the change that's going to come. So thank you very much. I'm Steve Sharp on behalf of PSCA. Please stay healthy and stay connected. Thank you.